Clara Whitmore did not cry when they laughed at her. She stood in the middle of Willow Creek's only general store, her travel bag still in her hand, mud on her boots from the stagecoach ride, and she looked every one of those laughing men dead in the eye without flinching. The storekeeper had said it loud enough for the whole street to hear, said that Elias Carter had gone and sent for a wife, and all he got was a woman who looked like she'd eaten 2 wives already. The men near the door roared. A woman by the counter covered her mouth, pretending it was a cough. And Clara stood there, 30 years old, heavy-set, plain-dressed, alone in a town that had already decided what she was worth. She set her bag down on the floorboards. She looked at the storekeeper. "I'll need directions to the Carter mill," she said. "And I'll need them given without commentary." The laughter stopped faster than a snuffed candle. She picked up her bag and walked out. If you've ever been the woman in that room, the one they laughed at, the one they counted out before you even opened your mouth, then this story is for you. Stay with me through every part of it. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss a single chapter, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Because what Clara Whitmore did next in Willow Creek, Wyoming territory in the summer of 1885 is the kind of thing they don't put in the history books. But it should be. The Carter Mill sat half a mile outside of town, beside a creek that had once run strong enough to power the whole valley's grain operation. By the summer of 1885, that creek still ran. The wheel still turned most days. But the sound it made was wrong. Anyone who'd grown up around water-powered mills would have heard it immediately, that low grinding complaint of wood and iron working harder than it should, compensating for damage it had been carrying too long. Clara heard it before she even reached the property line. She slowed her walk, tilted her head, and listened. The wheel was losing power on the left side. At least 2 paddles were damaged, possibly cracked through to the axle mount. The rest of the mechanism was compensating, which meant it was wearing itself down faster than normal. If nobody fixed it before winter, the whole wheel assembly would need replacing, and that was money Elias Carter clearly did not have. She knew this before she met the man. She knew this the way she knew most things, quietly, precisely, and without announcing it. Elias Carter was standing outside the mill when she arrived. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and was now something better. Weathered, honest, tired, in a way that came from genuine labor rather than weakness. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, and he wore his hat pushed back in a way that suggested he'd been running his hands through it all morning. There was flour dust on his forearms, and something in his expression that Clara recognized immediately. He was a man who had been losing for a long time and had stopped being surprised by it. He looked at her when she came up the path, and she watched him take her in her size, her plain dress, her travel bag, the fact that she'd walked from town instead of borrowing a horse. She saw the flicker of something cross his face. Not cruelty. Not the kind of open mockery she'd gotten at the general store. Just a kind of resigned disappointment he was trying very hard to conceal. She had seen that look before, too. It did not bother her the way it used to. "Mr. Carter," she said. "I'm Clara Whitmore. I believe you were expecting me." He pulled his hat off his head and held it at his side. "Miss Whitmore." "Yes, ma'am." Yes." He cleared his throat. "You made good time from the stage." "I walked." "I would have sent someone." "I preferred to walk," she said. "It gave me time to listen to your wheel." He paused. "I beg your pardon. Your water wheel, left side. You've got at least 2 paddles cracked, maybe more. The whole assembly is overcompensating, which means everything downstream is working harder than it needs to. You're burning through your mechanism trying to make up for damage you haven't repaired." She looked past him at the mill. "How long has it been making that sound?" Elias Carter stared at her for a moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable for most people. Clara was not most people. "About 8 months, he finally said. "And you haven't fixed it because the cost of the timber replacement plus the millwright labor." He stopped, looked at her. "How do you know what a cracked paddle sounds like?" "My family ran a grain operation in Ohio for 11 years, she said. "I helped with the books, the supply contracts, the quality grading, and anything else that needed doing. When you grow up around a mill, you learn to listen to it the way you learn to listen to a person. It tells you when something's wrong. He was quiet again. Then he put his hat back on his head. The ceremony's at 4 o'clock, he said. Reverend Aldous at the church. Nothing formal, just necessary. I understand, Clara said. Before that, I'd like to see the account books. He blinked. The account books. The ledgers. Contracts, invoices, outstanding debts, supplier agreements. Whatever records you have. I'd like to look them over this afternoon. We haven't even... Mr. Carter. Her voice was not unkind, but it was clear. We both know why you placed that advertisement. You need help running this operation. You need someone who can manage the household and the records and the business end of things that aren't getting managed right now. That's what I'm here to do. So let me start doing it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his shoulders changed, a slight release of tension, like a man who had been holding his breath for months. They're in the office, he said. Second room on the left. The office was a disaster. Not a chaotic disaster. It wasn't as though papers had been thrown everywhere. It was a quiet, organized disaster which was almost worse. Someone had been trying to keep order. The ledgers were stacked by year. The invoices were bundled with twine. The correspondence was sorted into rough piles. But everything about the underlying system was wrong in ways that had probably gone unnoticed for years because the person managing it had learned the system as it was, never questioning whether the system itself was the problem. Clara sat down at the desk, pushed her travel bag under it, and started reading. She did not stop for 3 hours. The Reverend Aldous performed the ceremony at 4 o'clock with 2 mill workers as witnesses. It lasted 11 minutes. Elias said the words in a flat, careful voice, the way a man signs a legal document he's read 3 times and accepted as binding. Clara said them clearly and without fuss. Afterward, one of the witnesses, a young man named Thomas, who had flour dust in his eyebrows and an expression of profound bewilderment, offered them a small congratulations and retreated quickly as though afraid of what he'd witnessed. Clara went back to the office. Elias stood in the doorway. You're going back to the ledgers. I haven't finished. It's past 4. The hour doesn't change what's in the books, she said without looking up. He stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he walked away without another word. She heard him later moving around in the kitchen, heard the sound of a fire being built and something going into a pot. She filed that information away with everything else she was learning about Elias Carter and kept reading. By the time the light failed and she had to stop, she had found 3 things that made the situation both worse and more interesting than she'd expected. The first thing was the debt. Elias owed considerably more than she'd initially assumed, not just to the lumber supplier and the grain commission merchant, but to a private lending company out of Denver called the Consolidated Western Holdings Group. The interest on that particular loan had been quietly climbing for 2 years. If nothing changed, the balloon payment coming due in 14 months would swallow the entire operation. The second thing was the contracts. Elias had signed supply agreements with 4 different buyers, all at prices that had been reasonable in 1881, but were now significantly below current market rates. None of the contracts had escalation clauses. All of them ran for another 2 years. The buyers were getting premium product, or what should have been premium product, at prices that made no sense for the quality being produced. The third thing was the flour itself. Clara had walked through the mill during her first hour on the property before the ceremony, just to see the setup. She had looked at the millstones, the bolting equipment, the storage containers. And she had taken a small amount of flour from 3 different production runs and examined it in the light. What Elias Carter was producing was not one grade of flour. He was producing at least 3 distinct grades, all mixed together and sold as a single product at a single price. He was selling high-quality winter wheat flour at the same rate as the coarser, lower-grade material it was blended with. He was throwing away money with every single sack he sold. She sat with this for a long time, her hands folded on the desk, the ledger still open in front of her. It was not incompetence that had brought Elias Carter to the edge of losing everything. He was clearly a man who worked hard, who cared about the mill, who had been trying for years to hold on. The problem was something she had seen before in different forms, in different operations. He had inherited a system and kept working the system without ever stepping back far enough to see that the system was working against him. And nobody around him had told him. She closed the ledger and went to find her husband. He was sitting on the front porch, a tin cup of coffee in his hand, looking out at the creek in the fading light. The sound of the water wheel was quieter now, slower the way machinery sounds in the early evening when the day's work is done. She sat down in the other chair on the porch. "You have 3 grades of flour," she said. He looked at her. "I have flour." "No, you have 3 distinct grades of product, and you're selling them all at the same price as though they're the same thing. Your winter wheat output, when it's properly bolted and separated, is producing a fine milled flour that should be selling for 40% more than you're charging. Instead, you're mixing it with your standard and coarse grades and averaging the price down." He was quiet. "You're losing money not because you can't make good flour," she continued. "You're losing money because you don't know how good your flour actually is." Clara. Furthermore, your contracts with the Kellerman Merchant House and the Dunbar Provisioning Company are both priced based on the 1881 territorial rate schedule, which was itself low. The market has moved. Your buyers know this. They have been benefiting from your not knowing it for 4 years. Those contracts are signed. They are, but they expire in 2 years. And between now and then, every sack you sell to Kellerman and Dunbar is subsidizing their margins, not yours. Elias set down his cup. "You found all this in one afternoon." "I found the beginning of it," she said. "I'll need another day or 2 to finish the full picture." "And then what?" "Then we make a plan." He looked at her. In the dim light, she couldn't read his expression well, but she could hear something in his silence. Not dismissal, not resistance. Something more complicated. The sound a man makes when he's been told hard truths by someone who clearly knows what they're talking about and doesn't quite know yet whether to be grateful or defensive. "You said your family had a grain operation," he said. "Yes." "What happened to it?" She looked out at the creek. "My father died. My brother took it over. I was the one who'd been running the books and the supply side for 5 years, but my brother was the son, so the operation passed to him. He wanted a fresh start his own way. So I was no longer needed." Elias was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It brought me here." She paused. "I don't want your pity, Mr. Carter. I want your willingness to try something different. That's all I'm asking for." He picked up his cup again, held it without drinking. "Elias," he said. She looked at him. "You can call me Elias. If we're going to be working together, the Mr. Business seems like a waste of time." She almost smiled. "All right, Elias." The next morning, she was up before him. She had made a list, a structured inventory of immediate priorities arranged by cost versus impact. The water wheel repairs were at the top. Without a functioning wheel, nothing else mattered. Below that came the storage reorganization, the grading separation, then the supplier contracts. The Denver debt was on a separate page. When Elias came into the kitchen and found her at the table with papers spread across it, he stopped in the doorway. "How long have you been up?" "Long enough," she said. "Sit down. I want to walk you through what I've laid out." He sat. She walked him through it methodically, item by item explaining her reasoning at each step, not softening anything, but also not speaking to him as though he were slow. She had learned early in her years managing her family's operation that the fastest way to lose someone's cooperation was to make them feel incompetent. You didn't need to hide hard truths. You just needed to present them as problems to be solved rather than failures to be judged. Elias listened. He asked good questions, specific questions, the questions of a man who understood the physical operation of a mill, even if the business side had gotten away from him. When she explained the grade separation, he immediately understood the mechanical adjustments required. When she laid out the contract situation, he winced but didn't deny it. When she got to the water wheel, he pulled the paper toward him and stared at her numbers. "I can do the carpenter work myself," he said. "I know where to source the timber cheaper than our current supplier. There's a man named Gruber up in the North Valley who mills his own pine board. Better quality, lower price, no commission. Can you reach him this week? I can ride out tomorrow." She nodded. "Then that goes first." Thomas the mill worker, with the perpetually bewildered expression, knocked on the door frame at 6:30 and stood looking at the two of them at a table covered in papers with an expression like he'd walked in on something he didn't have the vocabulary for. "Morning, Mr. Carter, ma'am." He paused. "We ready to start the day?" "Thomas," Elias said, standing, "we're going to be making some changes around here. Mrs. Carter is going to be going over the storage organization this week. I need you and Pete to give her whatever help she asks for." Thomas looked at Clara. Clara looked at Thomas. "I won't ask you to do anything that doesn't make sense," she said. "But if something I ask seems strange, tell me and I'll explain the reason. Fair?" He blinked. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. I'll start in the storage room in an hour. Make sure Pete knows." She was not prepared for how hard the town would push back. She should have expected it. She had grown up knowing how people read her size, her plainness, her directness. She knew how to manage the weight of those judgments usually. She had developed the ability to let them wash past her the way water moves past a stone. But Willow Creek had a particular meanness to it. It started with the storekeeper Reginald Holt, whose comment on her first day had been the opening note of a theme the town would play for weeks. Holt was a compact, self-important man who held a good deal of informal social power, not from any official position, but from being the person through whom most of the town's commerce and most of the town's gossip moved. He did not like Clara on sight. More precisely, he did not like the way she had looked at him and required him to give her directions without commentary. He was a man who expected women in Clara's circumstances to be appropriately diminished. And Clara had not been, so he made sure the town knew his opinion. By the end of the first week, she had heard 3 different versions of what Holt had said about her at various points around Willow Creek. That Elias Carter had made a desperate mistake. That the mill was doomed anyway, and now it would fail faster with a woman's meddling. That a man who listened to a wife like that deserved everything he got. She heard all of this through Thomas, who reported it with the careful neutrality of someone who wasn't sure yet which side would win and didn't want to commit too early. "What does Pete think?" she asked. Thomas considered. "Pete says Holt's been wrong about things before." "And what do you think?" He looked at the shelf she was reorganizing, the grain storage, reclassified, separated, labeled with a precision that had already cut their retrieval time in half. "I think this makes more sense than the old way," he said carefully. "That's enough for now," she said. There was also the matter of Garrett Finch. Willow Creek had a second mill operation, smaller but newer, owned by a man who had arrived in the valley 3 years earlier, with investor backing from a Denver commercial concern, and had been steadily cutting into Carter Mill's customer base ever since. Finch was 35, pleasant in the way salesmen were pleasant, and he had heard about Clara within 24 hours of her arrival. He came to the mill on a Thursday, unannounced, riding a horse too fine for the territory, wearing a suit too clean for a man who actually worked with grain. Elias was out at the North Valley talking to Gruber about the timber. Clara was in the office. "Is Carter around?" Finch asked Thomas from the saddle. "No, sir. Mr. Carter's away today." "Who's minding things?" Thomas glanced toward the office window. "Mrs. Carter's in the office." Finch smiled, the particular smile of a man who has just been told something he finds convenient. "Well," he said, "I suppose I'll say hello." He knocked on the office door frame. Clara looked up from the contract she was reviewing. "Mrs. Carter," he said with an easy warmth she recognized immediately as performance. "Garrett Finch. I run the Finch milling operation down the East Road. Thought I'd stop in and welcome you to Willow Creek. Mr. Finch?" She did not stand. "What can I do for you?" "Nothing formal, just being neighborly." He looked around the office at the reorganized papers, the open ledgers. "You've been busy in here." "I have. Getting the books in order. Among other things." He leaned in the doorway. You know I have some business experience that might be useful. If you're finding things in a state of disarray, I'd be happy to offer some perspective. What kind of perspective? The honest kind. His smile stayed easy practiced. Carter Mill has been struggling for a while, as I'm sure you've noticed. Sometimes the most practical thing, the kindest thing to a family's finances, is to recognize when a situation has become untenable and make arrangements accordingly. Arrangements. I represent some interests that might be willing to discuss. Mr. Finch? Her voice was pleasant. Absolutely pleasant. You came here while my husband is away, introduced yourself with a neighborly pretense, and are now suggesting we consider selling. Do I have that right? He blinked. I wouldn't characterize it. I would. She folded her hands on the desk. I appreciate you stopping in. I'll mention to my husband that you called. Good day. He stood in the doorway for one beat too long trying to find a recovery. He didn't find one. Good day, Mrs. Carter, he said, and left. Thomas appeared in the doorway, approximately 45 seconds later, slightly breathless. Did you just send Garrett Finch away? I did. Most people. He stopped. He usually gets what he wants when he comes around. I noticed that about him, Clara said, and went back to the contract. When Elias came back from the North Valley that evening, he had an agreement from Gruber for pine board, at a price that would cut their repair cost by nearly a third. He was in better spirits than she'd seen him color in his face from the ride, something almost like animation in his voice. She told him about Finch. The animation left. What exactly did he say? She repeated it precisely. Elias's jaw tightened. He sat down. He's been at it for 2 years, trying to buy me out or drive me out. So far it's been rumors and lowballing my customers. Now he's coming to my house while I'm away. He came to feel out whether I could be persuaded separately, she said. He thought I'd be easier to manage than you. Elias looked at her. Were you? She met his eyes. What do you think? Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Elias Carter's face didn't move easily in that direction, but close to one. I think Finch is going to have a harder time than he expected. He is, she agreed. But we should understand what we're dealing with. He mentioned interests. That means he has backing probably the same Denver money that's been pushing into Territorial Mills since '82. They want to control the market on this end of the route, and Carter Mill is the last independent operation of any size in this valley. So we're not just fighting Finch. No. We're fighting whoever Finch works for. She paused. Which means we need to move faster than I'd planned on the quality separation. We need buyers to see the difference in our product before the pressure campaign builds any more momentum. He stared at the table. Then quietly, Clara. Yes. How do you know all of this? The contracts, the grades, Finch, the backing. You've been here 8 days. Because I listened, she said simply. And I read everything you had. And I asked Thomas some questions yesterday afternoon. And I walked through the mill 3 times, looking at what's actually there instead of what I expected to find. He was quiet for a long moment. My father built this mill in 1861, he said. He ran it for 23 years before it passed to me. Even in the territory's worst years, he kept it running. After he died, he stopped, began again. I've been trying to do right by what he built. But the last 4 years, it's felt like I've been bailing water in a sinking boat, like I'm always just behind where I need to be. You were behind, she said. But you weren't sinking. You were standing in water that was rigged to look deeper than it was. Someone's been making sure you stayed confused about your own situation. He looked up. You mean Finch? Finch is part of it. But the Consolidated Western Holdings loan the terms are unusual. The interest adjustments aren't standard frontier lending practice. Someone structured that loan to tighten around you slowly the way a snare does. I want to look more closely at who set it up and when. Elias went very still. You think someone set me up to fail? I think someone made it very easy for you to fail, she said carefully. Whether it was deliberate or opportunistic, I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. He sat with that for a long time. The fire had burned down to coals, and the room was cooling. Outside the creek ran, and the wheel creaked on its way around. 8 days, he said again quietly. Not an accusation. More like a man adjusting to a new understanding of something he thought he knew. We're going to fix this, she said. The wheel first, then the grades, then the buyers, and then the loan. She stood gathering the papers she'd been working on. It won't be fast, and it won't be without a fight. But Carter Mill doesn't have to go under. You've been given a reason to believe it does. That's not the same thing as the truth. She moved toward the door. Clara? She stopped. Why are you doing this? You didn't have to know any of this in 8 days. You could have settled in, helped where it was comfortable, and let the rest go the way it was going. He paused. Why do you care what happens to this place? She turned and looked at him. Because I'm here, she said. And because I'm good at this. And because someone told me once that the only way to prove what you're worth is to do the work and let the results speak. She held his gaze. So that's what I'm going to do, Elias. She went to bed. He sat by the cooling fire for a long time after. The grade separation was completed by day 12. They reorganized the storage, recalibrated the bolting process, and began producing 3 clearly distinct grades. A coarse flour for commercial use, a standard grade for everyday household baking, and a fine winter wheat flour that was, after 3 separate test runs, genuinely exceptional. The day they finished the first clean production run of the fine grade, Clara had Thomas bring her a bag of it. She took it into the kitchen and baked bread. 2 loaves, one with their flour, and one with the best flour available from Holt's store, which Thomas had bought under a pretext she'd sent him on. Same recipe, same oven, same time. When Elias came in at noon, she put both loaves on the table. Try them, she said. He looked at the loaves. At her. At the loaves again. He picked up a piece of each one after the other. Chewed. Thought. Left one, he said. That's ours. He put the bread down and looked at it. That's considerably better. Yes, she said. It is. He sat down heavily. We've been selling that as the same product as the standard grade. For years, because nobody separated it out and showed anyone what it was. He was quiet. What's it worth? On the right market. At current territorial prices for premium grade winter wheat flour, 40 to 45% above your current blended price. Possibly more in Denver or the rail towns if we can build a buyer relationship there. He stared at the bread. My father knew, he said quietly. Knew what? He used to separate the grades. When I was young, he had a whole system, different storage, different labels, different buyers. He paused. After he got sick in the last year or two, things got simplified. He let it go because he didn't have the energy to maintain it. And after he passed, I just kept doing what was already in place. He set the bread down. I didn't know what I'd lost. Clara said nothing. Some things didn't need a response. They needed space. We're going to get this back, Elias said, more to himself than to her. We're actually going to get this back. We are, she said simply. And for the first time since she'd arrived in Willow Creek, something in the ground under her feet felt solid. Outside, the water wheel turned. The creek ran. Somewhere in the storage room, Thomas was singing something badly off-key, and Pete was arguing with him about it. The whole rickety, damaged, proud, struggling operation was still standing, still working, still worth fighting for. But the fight was only just beginning, and the man who had set all of this in motion, the man behind Garrett Finch, behind the Consolidated Western Holdings loan, behind the years of quiet, calculated pressure on Carter Mill, had not yet shown his face. He was waiting to see whether Clara Whitmore would last. He was about to find out. The confrontation she hadn't anticipated came on the 11th day, and it came from a direction she should have expected, but hadn't quite. Her name was Mrs. Loretta Bellwether. She arrived at the mill at 10 in the morning in a buggy driven by her husband, who stayed in the buggy while she came in. She was a woman of 60 or so, stout, well-dressed by Willow Creek standards, with the particular expression of a person who has appointed themselves as community moral authority and wears the appointment visibly. Clara was in the storage room working with Thomas and Pete when Mrs. Bellwether appeared at the door. "Mrs. Carter," she said. Clara looked up. "Yes, ma'am." "I'm Loretta Bellwether. My husband owns the Bellwether Dry Goods. I've been meaning to come speak to you." "Of course." Clara handed the clipboard to Thomas. "Give me a few minutes." She walked out to meet Mrs. Bellwether, who had positioned herself in the open space between the mill entrance and the storage building, neither quite in nor quite out, which Clara suspected was deliberate. "I'll be direct," Mrs. Bellwether said. "Please," Clara said. "The people of this town are concerned." She clasped her hands in front of her. "Concerned about what's happening here." "What is happening here according to the town? You've been reorganizing things, moving workers around, changing the way the mill operates. And frankly, there's concern about the influence you're having over Elias." "The influence," Clara repeated. "He's a man who's been having difficulties. He's vulnerable. And some people feel that a woman in your circumstances coming from nowhere, with no family connections in this territory—" "You're wondering whether I'm taking advantage of him," Clara said. Mrs. Bellwether drew herself up slightly. "I'm expressing what the community feels." "What the community feels," Clara said very carefully and pleasantly, "is that a large woman from out of state arrived and started telling a man how to run his own business, and that's unseemly and suspicious and probably won't end well. Is that about right?" Mrs. Bellwether's mouth tightened. "I wouldn't put it—" "How would you put it?" The older woman looked at her steadily. "I would put it that Elias Carter is a respected member of this community, and we don't want to see him hurt." "Neither do I," Clara said. "Which is why I've been working 18-hour days for the past 11 days, finding out what's actually been going wrong with this operation and building a plan to fix it." She kept her voice level. "I'm not here for Elias's land or his money or his reputation. I'm here because he needed someone who could do what I can do. And I can do quite a lot, Mrs. Bellwether, which I understand may be surprising from where you're standing." The older woman studied her for a long moment. Then something shifted, subtle but real, the way a door opens before it has fully opened. "My husband's accounts at this mill have been in good order for years," she said. "But the flour quality has fallen off, just in the last year or two. I've noticed it in my baking." Clara looked at her directly. "What kind of baking?" "Breads mostly, some pastry." "Does the flour feel coarser than it used to? Less consistent in the texture?" Mrs. Bellwether blinked. "Yes, exactly that." "Because the grades have been getting mixed in production," Clara said. "We're fixing that this week. By the end of the month, what you buy from this mill will be sorted properly. If you want a finer grade for pastry work, you'll be able to buy it specifically. It'll cost a bit more, but it'll be a genuinely better product than you've had in years." Mrs. Bellwether was quiet. She looked at Clara one more time, the kind of long, careful look that was really a reassessment. Then she nodded once. "I'll tell Harold to watch for it," she said. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter." "Good morning, Mrs. Bellwether." The buggy rolled away. Pete appeared at Clara's shoulder. "Is she going to cause trouble?" he asked. "I don't think so," Clara said. "Not anymore." She was right. And it mattered more than it seemed, because Loretta Bellwether spoke to people, and people listened. The particular endorsement that came from a woman like that, not given loudly, not given publicly, just quietly withheld from the chorus of criticism, was its own kind of permission. It told the uncertain people of Willow Creek that maybe, just maybe, they were allowed to reserve their judgment a little longer. That was all Clara had ever asked for. Time and the chance to do the work. The letter arrived on a Monday. Clara was in the mill office cross-referencing the Gruber timber invoice against the repair estimate Elias had drawn up the night before when Thomas knocked twice and set an envelope on the edge of the desk without a word. The seal on the back was embossed a small printed logo she didn't recognize, but the return address told her everything she needed to know before she even broke the wax. Consolidated Western Holdings Group, Denver, Colorado Territory. She set down her pen. She did not open the letter immediately. That was a habit she had developed years ago in her father's Ohio operation when something important arrived. You sat with it for 30 seconds before opening it, because those 30 seconds were the last ones you'd have without knowing what was inside. Once you knew, you couldn't unknow. So you used those 30 seconds well. She used them to think about the loan document she had been studying for 2 weeks, the acceleration clause in Section 7, subsection C, the precise wording, the conditions. Then she opened the letter. It was short. 3 paragraphs written in the careful, pleasant language that lawyers use when they want to sound reasonable while describing something that isn't. The gist of it was, this Consolidated Western Holdings had conducted a routine review of their Frontier lending portfolio and had identified the Carter Mill account as a matter requiring attention. They were writing to inform Mr. Carter that under the terms of the original agreement, specifically Section 7, they were invoking a formal assessment period. A representative of the company would be visiting Willow Creek within 30 days to evaluate operational capacity and compliance with the contract's performance thresholds. If the mill was found to be operating below 60% of its 1882 capacity baseline, the full outstanding balance would become immediately due. Clara read it twice. Then she folded it, placed it exactly where it had been, and walked out to the mill floor. Elias was at the wheel assembly with a mallet and a measuring line checking the fit of the new paddle Gruber's pine board had finally made possible. He had been working on the repair for 3 days and was close, she could tell from the way he moved, the focused efficiency of someone finishing something rather than starting it. "Elias," she said. He looked up, saw her face, set down the mallet. "What happened?" She held up the letter. "Consolidated Western Holdings is sending a representative. 30 days. They're invoking the operational assessment clause." He went still in the way she had come to recognize, not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of a man absorbing a blow he had halfway been expecting. He wiped his hands on his trousers and took the letter from her. "Read it." "Read it again." 60% of the 1882 baseline, he said. "Yes." "What are we running at right now?" She had done the calculation the previous week before the letter arrived because she had seen this coming. "Approximately 54%. The wheel damage has been costing us 6 to 8% of output capacity for months. If we finish the repair by the end of this week and the wheel runs clean for the next 3 weeks, we'll be at 63, maybe 65% by the time their man arrives." He looked at the wheel assembly, back at her. 3 weeks. Which means we finish the repair this week, no delays. He handed the letter back. "We'll finish it." "There's something else," she said. "The timing of this letter isn't a coincidence. Someone told them to look at us now, before the repair was complete, before the grade separation started bringing in better prices." She folded the letter carefully. "The only person in Willow Creek who knew our exact situation well enough to flag us to a Denver lending company at the right moment is someone who had access to information about the mill's current output." Elias was quiet for a moment. "Finch? Or whoever Finch reports to," she said. "Either way, this isn't a routine review. This is a move. They're trying to call the loan before we recover enough to service it." He picked up the mallet, turned it in his hands. "Then we don't give them the chance." That was the thing about Elias Carter that Clara had been learning when he understood clearly what he was fighting. He fought. No hesitation. He just put his head down and went to work. She had watched it happen with the timber sourcing, the grade separation, the storage reorganization. Each time she laid out the problem plainly, he absorbed it and moved. She was beginning to think that nobody had ever laid anything out plainly for him before. By Thursday, the water wheel was repaired. Thomas and Pete had worked alongside Elias for 3 straight days, and Clara had kept them all fed and the paperwork moving simultaneously. And when the new paddle assembly, seated cleanly in the housing and the wheel, began its first full rotation, without that grinding complaint of damaged wood overcompensating, when the sound changed to the clean, even rhythm of machinery running the way it was built to run, All four of them stood there for a moment, just listening. Pete said, "Well, I'll be." Thomas didn't say anything. He just nodded very slowly, the way young men do when they're trying not to look moved by something. Elias looked at Clara. "Better," she said. "Better," he agreed. But that was Thursday, and Saturday brought a different kind of trouble. Clara was at the Mercantile, the one on the far end of Main Street, not Holt's place where she had taken her business, after the first day when she heard her name. Not her name exactly. Her description. Two women she didn't know were standing near the fabric display, talking in the not-quite quiet voices of people who want to be heard without appearing to want to be heard. Carter wife, the large one from Ohio. Holt says she's been going through the books, changed the whole storage system. Now she's telling Elias what to charge for his flour. Poor man probably doesn't even realize she's making a fool of him. My husband said the mill workers seem to think she knows what she's talking about. But honestly, a woman who shows up from nowhere with no family, no references. Probably why nobody else wanted her. Clara kept her back to them. She finished counting out her coins. She thanked the woman behind the counter. She picked up her package and walked out. She did not let herself feel it until she was outside and moving. And then she let herself feel it for exactly the length of time it took to walk half a block. Then she put it away, because the work didn't stop because somebody was unkind. But she stored the information. Holt was still talking, and the things he was saying were stitching themselves into the way Willow Creek saw the mill, saw Elias, saw her. She thought about it all the way back to the mill, and by the time she came through the office door, she had the beginning of an idea. It was Elias who noticed something was wrong. He was coming out of the storage room when she came in, and he looked at her face for 2 seconds and said, "What happened?" "Nothing serious," she said. "Clara." She set down the package. "I heard some talk at the Mercantile. Holt's version of things passed through two women who didn't know I was standing behind them." He went very quiet in a different way from the letter quiet. This was the quiet of a man getting angry. "What did they say?" "The usual. That I'm making a fool of you. That nobody wanted me. That I showed up from nowhere with nothing." She looked at him steadily. "Don't get angry about it, Elias. It doesn't help us." He stopped, exhaled. "It's not right." "No," she said. "It isn't. But right and useful aren't the same thing, and right now I need useful." She pulled out the chair and sat down. "Holt has a platform. He talks to everyone who comes through that store, which is everyone in this valley at some point. As long as he's telling his version of events, we're fighting two battles at once, the Denver company and the town's opinion of us." "So what do we do about Holt?" She looked at him. "We give him a reason to change his story." He waited. "His wife," she said. "Margaret Holt. She bakes. I've seen the competition ribbon at the back of the store. She won the county baking exhibition 3 years running, 1879 through 1881. She hasn't entered since, and I'd wager it's because the flour quality has dropped, and she hasn't been able to figure out why." Elias was quiet for a moment. "You want to sell Holt's wife our premium flour." "I want to send Holt's wife a sample of our premium flour," she said. Quietly. No fanfare, no conditions. Just a 2-pound bag with a note explaining what it is and how it differs from what she's been using. And then I want to wait. And if she ignores it, then we've lost 2 pounds of flour and nothing else. But if she uses it, if Margaret Holt bakes something with our flour and it's as good as I think it will be, she's going to tell someone. And whoever she tells will tell someone. And it'll get back to Reginald eventually, and he's going to have a choice between his pride and his wife's happiness." Elias stared at her. "That's a considerably longer game than I expected." "Most good ones are," she said. She sent the flour that afternoon with Thomas as the delivery boy, with a note written in her plainest hand, explaining the grade and the milling process. She did not sign it with her name. She signed it Carter Mill, Willow Creek. Then she went back to the account books because the Denver company's 30-day clock was running, and there were 2 things she still hadn't resolved. The first was the acceleration clause. She had been reading territorial lending law for a week, borrowed from legal almanacs found under the desk, and she had found something significant. The clause required that capacity assessment be conducted by an independent third-party verifier, not a company-appointed representative. The letter from Consolidated Western had implied their own man would conduct the evaluation, which was not what the contract actually allowed. The second was the origin of the loan itself. She had been tracing it backward for days through the Denver commercial directories and the territorial business filings that Elias had accumulated without reading the kind of documents that arrived in envelopes and got filed away because dealing with them felt like one more thing on a list already too long. What she was finding slowly, like pulling a thread in dim light, was that Consolidated Western Holdings Group was not an independent lending company. It was a subsidiary. The parent company's name was at the bottom of a 1880 territorial registration document buried in a stack of papers that had lived under a flour sack for 3 years. Meridian Land and Commerce, Denver. She wrote the name down. She looked at it. Then she went to find the documents Garrett Finch had left behind when he'd tried to buy the Whitfield property 2 years ago. The property 2 miles north of the mill, which Elias had mentioned in passing one evening without seeming to realize it was significant. Those documents were in county records, and Elias had a copy because the attempted sale had involved a right-of-way dispute that touched Carter Mill's water rights. She found the Whitfield file in the third drawer. She found Meridian Land and Commerce on the second page of Finch's purchase offer. The same company. Finch worked for Meridian. Meridian owned the lending company that held Elias's loan. The same organization that had been trying to buy Carter Mill through Finch's persuasion had also been quietly squeezing the mill through its loan terms. It was the same hand wearing 2 different gloves. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then she thought about the capacity clause and the 30-day clock, and she began to understand that what she was dealing with was not opportunism. It was a plan. A patient multi-year plan to own this valley's entire grain operation, and Carter Mill was the last piece that didn't fit. She needed a lawyer. The problem was that Willow Creek's only lawyer, a man named Beaumont, had been described by Thomas in his characteristically neutral way as a man who gets along with everybody and agrees with whoever he talked to last. That was not the kind of lawyer she needed. She needed someone who would not blink at a fight with a Denver corporation. She wrote 3 letters that evening, one to a law firm in Cheyenne, whose name she'd found in the territorial bar directory, one to the Federal Land Office, requesting records on Meridian Land and Commerce's holdings in Wyoming Territory, and one to the County Recorder's Office, requesting copies of all property transactions involving Meridian or any of its affiliates within a 50-mile radius of Willow Creek. Elias came in while she was sealing the 3rd envelope. "It's past 10, he said. "I know." He came in and sat down across from her. He looked at the letters. He looked at the papers spread across the desk, the loan document, the Whitfield file, the page, with Meridian Land and Commerce, written on it, in her careful hand. "Tell me what you found," he said. She told him. She laid it out in order: Finch Meridian, the loan, the subsidiary relationship, the 2-glove strategy. Elias listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he asked one question. "They've been planning this for years," he said. "At least since 1882, possibly longer. And my father's mill was always the end goal." "Your father's mill is the water rights," she said. "Whoever controls the creek controls the entire valley's grain capacity. The mill is valuable, but the water access is what Meridian actually wants. With your rights combined with the Whitfield property Finch almost acquired, they'd control irrigation for 3 townships." He was quiet for a very long time. "My father used to say this mill was never just a business," he said finally. "He said it was a responsibility, to the valley, to the farmers, to the families who depended on it." He looked at the paper with Meridian's name on it. "He'd have fought this." "I know," Clara said. "How do you know that? You never met him." She looked at him steadily. "Because you're fighting it, and you learned who to be from him." Something moved across his face briefly, then gone the way firelight shifts. He looked down at the table. "The lawyer in Cheyenne," he said. "You think they'll take the case?" "I think when they see what I've found, they'll want to," she said. "This isn't just a mill owner fighting a lending company. This is evidence of coordinated fraud, using subsidiary structures to circumvent fair lending practice. Any territorial lawyer worth his salt will recognize that the Federal Land Office would be interested." Federal. He looked up. "You'd bring in federal." "I'd use every tool available," she said simply. "That's what they've done. We should do the same." He reached across the table and picked up the page with Meridian's name on it and looked at it for a long time. "All right," he said. "Do what you need to do." She sealed the third letter. The following week arrived with the particular cruelty of information moving faster than truth. Someone had been talking. Not Holt this time, or not only Holt. There was a newer, more specific version of the story circulating Willow Creek by Wednesday, and it had details that could only have come from one source. The details were about the Denver letter, about the capacity assessment, about the 30-day clock. Somehow word had gotten out that Consolidated Western Holdings was coming to evaluate Carter Mill, and the story that reached Clara's ears through Mrs. Bellwether, who had taken to passing information her way with the dignified efficiency of a woman who had decided which side she was on, was that the Denver company was expected to call the loan that Carter Mill was finished, that it was only a matter of weeks. Clara found Thomas in the storage room that afternoon. "Who knew about the letter?" she asked. He went still in the way guilty people go still when they're surprised. "Ma'am?" "The Denver letter. Elias knew. I knew. Who else?" I might have mentioned to Pete that there was a letter from Denver. I didn't know what was in it. I just saw the seal." "And Pete mentioned it to whom?" A long pause. "Pete's wife's cousin works at the telegraph office." Clara closed her eyes briefly. "All right," she said. "It's done. We deal with what is not what should have been." She looked at Thomas. "From now on, anything that comes into this office stays in this office. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry I didn't think—" "I know you didn't," she said. "That's why we're having this conversation now instead of later." But the leak changed things, as leaks always did. By Thursday, 2 of Carter Mill's regular customers had sent word that they were holding their next order pending the outcome of the Denver assessment. By Friday, the Dunbar Provisioning Company had sent a letter of inquiry asking whether the mill anticipated any interruption in its service schedule. Clara answered Dunbar's letter the same day, professionally calmly with the precise language of someone who was not worried. She confirmed no anticipated service interruptions, mentioned that the mill had recently completed a significant equipment repair increasing output capacity, and included the price schedule for the premium grade because Dunbar had been buying blended flour at standard rates for 4 years, and if they saw a premium option at the right price, they might convert part of their order. She mailed it before sunset. Elias found her at the desk and read over the letter copy she'd kept. "You didn't mention the assessment," he said. "I mentioned a capacity increase, which is accurate. I'm not going to announce our vulnerabilities to our customers." He pulled the other chair from the corner and sat down. "How much do we need before the assessment?" She had done the calculation. "If the wheel runs at current capacity for 3 weeks, we hit 63%. But 63 is marginal. I want to be at 68 before the Consolidated Western representative arrives, because I believe we're going to contest the assessment itself, and I want enough room that even a conservative evaluator can't argue with the numbers. How do we get from 63 to 68? We take on 3 new orders. Small ones are fine. New customers, regular customers. We haven't been serving at full capacity. Anyone who will generate confirmed output runs in the next 3 weeks. I need the mill running at full production, not just repaired." He thought about it. "The Henderson farm, north of Gruber's property. Old Henderson's been hauling his grain to the Finch operation for a year because we kept having delays. But his son Walt told me last spring he wasn't happy with Finch's quality." "Could you ride out to the Henderson farm tomorrow?" "I can go today," he said. "It's only an hour." She looked at him. "What would you say to them?" "I'd tell them the wheel's repaired. I'd tell them we're running clean, and I'd ask Walt if he'd like to see the difference between what we're producing now and what Finch has been giving him." He paused. Walt Henderson is the kind of man who respects plain talk. Take a sample of the premium grade with you, she said. Not to sell it. Just to show him. Let him hold it. Elias stood up, reached for his hat. Anything else? Yes, she said. When you ride past Finch's operation, don't look at it. He almost smiled. I never do. He brought back a signed agreement from the Henderson farm before dark. 200 bushels first delivery the following week. Clara noted it in the ledger and allowed herself 30 seconds of something close to relief before she moved on to the next problem. The next problem arrived the following morning in the form of a man she hadn't seen before, well-dressed for a frontier town, carrying a leather document case, asking at Holt's store for directions to Carter Mill. The man arrived at the mill office at 10 o'clock and introduced himself as Mr. Raymond Oakes, representing Consolidated Western Holdings Group, Denver. 18 days early. Clara kept her face entirely neutral. Mr. Oakes, she said, we weren't expecting your visit for another 12 days at the earliest. We find it more productive to conduct assessments without extensive preparation on the part of the reviewed party, he said pleasantly. He was a slight man, 30s, with the precise manner of someone trained to deliver bad news with paperwork. I hope it's not inconvenient. Not at all, she said. Please come in. Elias was at the mill. She sent Thomas to get him with a look that Thomas, to his credit, read correctly the first time and moved on without asking questions. While she waited, she offered Oakes coffee, which he accepted, and she asked him about his travel from Denver, which he described, and she listened to every word with the attentiveness of someone gathering information they intended to use. By the time Elias came through the door with flour on his hands and the alert eyes of a man who'd been briefed in 20 words, she had established 3 things. Oakes had arrived on yesterday's stage, meaning the decision to advance the assessment had been made at least 5 days ago. He had been in communication with a local contact. He mentioned taking a meeting with a party familiar with the operation the previous evening, which could only mean Finch. And he had already, before visiting the mill, completed what he called a preliminary market review. Elias stood in the doorway, hat in hand, and looked at Oakes with the steady gaze of a man who had worked the land his father built and had no intention of doing otherwise. Mr. Oakes, he said, welcome to Carter Mill. Mr. Carter. Oakes opened his document case. I appreciate your time. I'd like to begin with a review of your current output records, and then I'll need to observe the wheel operation and storage capacity. Of course, Elias said. He looked at Clara. The output records are current through last week, she said, turning to the relevant ledger. I'll pull the production logs for the last 3 months, which will give you the clearest picture of the repair impact on capacity. She set the ledger on the desk in front of Oakes. You'll see a dip in weeks 14 through 17 corresponding to the paddle damage and the recovery curve beginning in week 18 following our repair completion last Thursday. Oakes looked at the ledger, then at her. You keep these records? I do, she said. A brief pause, the kind that happened when a man recalibrated who he was actually dealing with in a room. I see. And who are you, ma'am? Clara Carter, she said. I manage the books, the contracts, and the production records for this operation. Another pause. I was told the mill's operational records were in some disarray. They were, she said pleasantly. They're not anymore. Oakes spent 4 hours at the mill that day. He walked the floor with Elias, asked about the wheel assembly, measured the storage capacity, reviewed the production schedule going back 8 months. Clara watched him from the office window while she worked, because watching people work told you things about them that conversation never did. What she noticed was that Oakes had stopped smiling about 40 minutes in. A man who came to deliver a killing blow should have moved through the visit with quiet satisfaction. Instead, he was on his 3rd pass through the production records, and his expression had shifted into something harder to read. The numbers were good. Not perfect, not yet, but closer than anyone had told him they'd be. When Oakes came back to the office at mid-afternoon, he sat down across from Clara and opened his document case again. Mrs. Carter, he said, I want to be transparent with you about something. She set down her pen. Please. My company's assessment, based on information available prior to this visit, anticipated that this operation was running significantly below the 60% capacity threshold outlined in the original loan agreement. He paused. The records I've reviewed today tell a different story. I imagine they do, she said. He looked at her carefully. You were aware we were coming early. I was aware the timing of this assessment was unusual, she said. I read the original contract carefully, Mr. Oakes, including Section 7, subsection C. She let that land. Including the provision that assessment must be conducted by an independent third-party verifier rather than a company representative. The quiet that followed was not a comfortable one. Oakes closed his document case. He picked up his coffee and held it and looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something important. You're suggesting our assessment process isn't compliant with the contract terms. I'm observing that the contract specifies an independent verifier, she said. I've engaged a law firm in Cheyenne to review that question. I expect to hear from them within the week. She paused. I mention it not as a threat, Mr. Oakes. I mention it because I believe in transparency. He looked at her for a long moment. Who helped you understand the contract? I read it myself, she said. Several times. Another pause. Then his voice changed not dramatically, but noticeably, the way a man's voice changes when he stops performing and starts talking. The information provided to my company about the status of this operation, he said, appears to have been incomplete. Incomplete is one word for it, Clara said. He held her gaze. If the capacity numbers continue on their current trajectory over the next 2 weeks, this operation will be within compliant range by the time any formal assessment could be legitimately conducted. That's my calculation as well, she said. He nodded once. I'll need to report my findings to Denver. I'd expect nothing less, she said. And when you do, Mr. Oakes, you might want to include a note about the third-party verification requirement, because the law firm in Cheyenne will certainly be including it in their review. He picked up his document case, stood, looked at her one more time, with the expression of a man who had just realized he'd been sent to do a job built on false foundations. Good afternoon, Mrs. Carter, he said. Good afternoon, Mr. Oakes. Safe travels. Elias was in the doorway before the dust from Oakes's horse had settled. He looked at Clara with the focused attention of a man who needed to know the outcome before he could decide how to feel. Well, he said. He'll report that the numbers don't support the acceleration clause, she said. Not yet, and not if we keep the current trajectory. And the independent verifier issue. That's the piece that changes everything, she said. If Consolidated Western proceeds with an assessment conducted by their own employee, rather than an independent party, they've violated the terms of their own contract, which means any acceleration they try to invoke would be legally challengeable. Elias was quiet for a moment. You knew that before he came. I suspected it. The Cheyenne lawyers will confirm it. He sat down. He looked at his hands, big hands, a working man's hands, flour rough and calloused. Clara, when you came here, when you stepped off that stage, did you know any of this was waiting? I knew there was debt, she said. I didn't know that debt was a trap. I found that after. And if you'd known before you came, she thought about it honestly. I'd have come anyway, she said, because I don't run from that kind of thing. I never have. She paused. The question was never whether I'd come. The question was whether you'd let me work. He looked at her across the desk. The afternoon light was going flat, and the mill was quiet, the wheel turning, the creek running, Thomas and Pete long gone for the day. Just the two of them, and the paperwork, and the problem they were in the middle of solving. You've let me work, she said. That matters more than you know. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter than usual. I don't know what I expected when I placed that advertisement. I was desperate enough that I wasn't thinking about what I expected. I just needed help. I know. I didn't expect to find someone who understood this place better in 3 weeks than I'd understood it in 4 years. I didn't expect to feel like we were fighting this together. He looked at her steadily. I want you to know that I see what you're doing, and I'm grateful for it. Clara looked back at him. In the weeks she had been at Carter Mill, she had been looked at in a great many ways, with mockery, with skepticism, with the calculating gaze of men like Finch and Oakes, trying to figure out whether she was a problem or an opportunity. Elias was looking at her with none of those things. He was just looking at her. The way people look at each other when they've been through something together and have decided quietly and without announcement that the other person is someone they trust. You're welcome, she said. Outside, the water wheel kept turning. The letter from Cheyenne arrived 6 days later. Clara was already at the desk when Thomas brought it in, and she read it standing up, which was something she only did when she needed to move quickly from reading to acting. The firm was called Hargrove and Associates, and the senior partner, a man named Emmett. Hargrove had written back in the careful, measured language of a lawyer who had seen a great deal and was trying not to appear too interested too quickly. He was very interested. He confirmed her reading of the acceleration clause. He confirmed the independent verifier requirement. He noted with the particular dryness of a man who had spent 20 years watching frontier corporations abuse lending structures that the conduct she described a company-appointed representative conducting what was contractually required to be an independent assessment represented a significant violation of the original agreement. He further noted that if the subsidiary relationship between Consolidated Western Holdings and Meridian Land and Commerce could be documented, there was a viable argument for fraudulent inducement in the original loan terms. He wanted to come to Willow Creek. He could be there within 2 weeks. Clara folded the letter and walked directly to the mill floor. Elias was running the wheel at full capacity, a full production morning, the kind that had become their new standard since the repair, and the sound of it was clean and steady, the sound of a machine doing exactly what it was built to do. He saw her coming and read her face and cut the intake flow to slow the wheel. Cheyenne, he said. Hargrove's coming, she said. 2 weeks. He confirmed everything. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then, how much will it cost? He works on contingency for cases involving corporate fraud, she said. Which means he takes a percentage of any settlement or judgment rather than billing by the hour. You think he'd settle? I think Meridian would rather settle quietly than have a federal examination of their subsidiary lending structure become public record, she said. But that's not the outcome we want to force. It's leverage. He looked at her. What outcome do we want? The loan restructured at fair terms. The acceleration clause removed, and documentation of Meridian's relationship with Finch made available to the Territorial Land Office so that any future purchase attempts they make in this valley are on record. You want them exposed, not just stopped. Stopped only works until they find another angle, she said. Exposed changes the cost calculation. They move to easier targets. He was quiet again, the way he got when he was thinking something through rather than reacting to it. All right, he said. Let Hargrove come. What neither of them had anticipated was what would happen in the 2 weeks before he arrived. It started with Margaret Holt. Clara had sent the premium flower sample 10 days earlier and had heard nothing. She had not expected complete silence, and she had begun to suspect the effort had fallen flat. Then Thomas came in on a Tuesday morning with the particular expression he wore when he had information he wasn't sure how to deliver. Reginald Holt, he said. Clara looked up. What about him? He came to the mill this morning. Before we opened, he was waiting at the gate. She set down her pen. Holt came here. Yes, ma'am. Where is he? He's outside. He said he'd wait. She stood up, smoothed her dress, and went to the door. Reginald Holt was standing near the entrance to the storage building, with his hat in his hands, which was the first remarkable thing. In all the weeks she'd been in Willow Creek, she had never seen Holt without his hat on his head. He wore it like authority. Seeing him holding it at his side made him look shorter and considerably less certain of himself. Mrs. Carter, he said. Mr. Holt, she said. This is a surprise. Yes? He cleared his throat. I imagine it is. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had rehearsed something and was now discovering the rehearsal hadn't covered all the possibilities. I wanted to that as Margaret asked me to come. Clara waited. The flour, he said. Whatever you sent over. She used it for her county fair entry, the pastry competition. Another pause. She won. Clara kept her expression neutral. I'm glad to hear it. She hasn't won in 4 years, Holt said. She used to win every year. Then she stopped because she said the flour had changed. He was looking at his hat now. I told her she was imagining it. Most people would have, Clara said. I was wrong. He said it flatly, like a man pulling a tooth, not gentle about it, just quick. She wasn't imagining it. And I've been telling the town things about you and about this mill that may not have been entirely fair. Clara studied him. This was not the Reginald Holt who had laughed when she walked into his store on her first day in Willow Creek. What kinds of things, Mr. Holt? She said. He met her eyes. That you were taking advantage of Elias, that you didn't know what you were doing, that the mill was going to fail regardless. He paused. I said it more than I should have, to more people than I should have. Yes, she said. You did. He flinched. She hadn't softened it, and she didn't intend to, but she didn't press it either. She let it sit there between them because it needed to sit there before anything else could happen. I'd like to start buying your premium grade, he said, for the store, and I'd like to stop saying things that aren't fair. Both of those would be welcome, Clara said. He put his hat back on. Margaret says to tell you she'd like to know the milling process, if you'd be willing to explain it sometime. Tell her she's welcome any time, Clara said. I'll show her myself. He nodded once stiffly and turned to go. Mr. Holt? He turned back. The flour doesn't change back, she said. What we're producing now, that's the new standard. Your customers will notice. You might want to get ahead of it. He looked at her for a moment. Then, yes, ma'am. And he left. Thomas appeared beside her like he'd materialized from the air. Did Reginald Holt just apologize to you? He acknowledged an error, she said, which is as close as that man comes. I've never seen him do that before. His wife won a competition she hadn't won in 4 years, Clara said. That tends to clarify a man's thinking. She went back inside. Don't tell Elias yet. Let me tell him. She told Elias that evening, and his reaction was not what she'd expected. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that direction, quiet, short, surprised. Holt, he said. Holt, she confirmed. The man who's been telling this whole valley I married a woman who'd run the mill into the ground. The same. He shook his head slowly. And it was the pastry competition. His wife's pastry competition, she said, which she'd stopped entering because the flour wasn't right. He looked at her across the table. You figured that out. I noticed the ribbon, she said. The date on it. And I asked Thomas whose wife bakes in this town, and Margaret Holt's name came up 3 separate times. He was quiet for a moment. Clara, can I ask you something? Of course. Where did you learn to think like this? Not just the accounts, the milling knowledge. The way you put things together. My mother, she said. She ran our grain operation while my father's name was on everything. She said the difference between someone who survives a hard situation and someone who doesn't comes down to whether they're willing to pay attention to things other people find beneath them. She paused. She died when I was 19, but she'd have liked this fight. She always said the best problems were the ones where the other side thought they'd already won. Elias was quiet. I'm sorry, he said. The kind that meant it. He almost smiled at the rest of it. Then the moment passed, and they went back to work the way they always did. The next blow came from a direction she should have anticipated and didn't. On a Wednesday, 11 days before Hargrove was due to arrive, Garrett Finch rode into town with 2 men she didn't recognize. Broad-shouldered, well-dressed in the way that said money rather than work, wearing the quiet authority of people accustomed to having decisions made in their presence rather than by them. They went to the hotel. They stayed for 2 days. Clara found out about them through Mrs. Bellwether, who had a gift for knowing things that Clara was beginning to actively appreciate. "Meridian men," Mrs. Bellwether said, on the pretext of inquiring about a flower order. At least that's what Harold heard at the barber. "How does Harold know what Meridian men look like?" Clara asked. "He doesn't, but one of them paid for his hotel room with a bank draft on the Meridian Land and Commerce account. The hotel clerk mentioned it. Clara absorbed that. Did Finch bring them to any meetings in town?" "They went to Beaumont's office," Mrs. Bellwether said. "Beaumont, Willow Creek's pliable lawyer, the one who agreed with whoever he'd talked to last. This morning, about an hour." "Thank you," Clara said. "Is there anything I should tell people?" Mrs. Bellwether asked, with the careful casualness of someone who had become invested and was offering resources. "Tell people the mill took on the Henderson account this week and has 3 additional orders pending," Clara said. "That's accurate, and they're welcome to know it." Mrs. Bellwether nodded with the satisfaction of someone given a useful task and left. Clara sat for a long time after. Meridian had sent men to Beaumont. That meant they were worried about Hargrove about the land office letters about the independent verifier issue. It meant Oakes had reported back, and they understood they were no longer dealing with an exhausted mill owner who could be quietly squeezed into a distressed sale. They were dealing with her, and they didn't like it. She was still thinking through the implications when Elias came in from the floor and found her staring at the wall. "What happened?" he said. She told him about the Meridian men. He listened. When she finished, he said, "They're here to stop Hargrove. Or make an offer before he arrives and the legal situation becomes more complex," she said. "If they come to us with a restructured loan offer in the next few days, it'll be because they want to close this before a Cheyenne lawyer starts filing things." "And should we take it?" "That depends on what they offer, and on whether the offer is genuine or another delay tactic." She paused. "I want to hear from Hargrove first. I'm writing to him today to warn him the situation has accelerated." The offer came the following morning. Not from the Meridian men directly, they sent Finch, which was itself a statement about how they valued the interaction. Finch arrived at 9 o'clock, his pleasant manner slightly less polished than normal, wearing a little thin around the edges. Elias met him at the door. "Finch," he said. "Elias." Finch tipped his hat. "I've got some people in town who'd like to talk. I think you might find what they have to say worth hearing." "Is that so?" "They're prepared to offer a significant restructuring of the Consolidated Western Loan. Lower interest rate extended term, the acceleration clause removed." Elias looked at him steadily. "Why?" Finch blinked. "I beg your pardon. Why would they do that?" 3 weeks ago they were trying to call the loan. Now they want to restructure it. What changed? Business conditions change. They've reassessed. Because my wife sent 3 letters, and their own assessor's report didn't say what they needed it to say," Elias said. "That's what changed. So I'll ask again. What exactly are they offering, and what do they want in exchange?" A pause. "They'd want a right-of-way agreement on the North Creek access." Elias went very still. The North Creek access. The water rights that, combined with the Whitfield property Meridian had almost acquired 2 years ago, would give them control of irrigation for 3 townships. Clara had explained this to him weeks ago, and he had understood it then. He understood it now. "No," he said. Finch's expression shifted into something less pleasant and more honest. "Elias, this is a good offer. Better terms, cleared debt schedule. In exchange for the thing they actually want, which isn't the mill and never was," Elias said. "The answer is no, Garrett. Tell your people the answer is no." "You're making a mistake." "I've made plenty of those," Elias said. "This isn't one of them. Good morning." He closed the door. Clara was in the doorway. "Did it work?" He considered it. "No, but it would have. 6 weeks ago that conversation would have worked." "What changed?" He picked up his coffee. "I stopped doing this alone," he said, and went to work. She stayed a moment with that answer. Then she went back to the desk. The second thing Meridian did was go to the town council. The Meridian men requested a meeting and got one because Meridian's money was in the valley's agricultural lending, and nobody on the council was eager to antagonize it. Clara knew about it because Mrs. Bellwether's husband, Harold, was one of the five, and he came to the mill Friday morning looking like a man who hadn't slept. They want the council to issue a statement, he said, about the mill's financial stability. Can you arrange a meeting? Clara said. Not a formal session, just the five of you here so they can hear what we actually know. Tomorrow morning, Harold said. Tomorrow morning, she said. The 5 council members arrived at 9. Clara gave them 40 minutes. She showed them the documents, the Meridian registration, the subsidiary relationship, the loan terms, the letters the farm operations had received. She explained the acceleration clause, the independent verifier requirement, and what Calhoun had said about the federal investigation. She answered their questions without hedging. At the end of it, Prater, who ran the feed store and had been on the council for 11 years, leaned back in his chair and said, "They sent letters to the farm accounts, while a federal investigation was already in process." "That's what Marshal Calhoun indicated," Clara said. He looked at the document in front of him. "That's not a company that's confident in its position. That's a company that's scared." "That's my read," Clara said. He looked at the other council members. "I'm not signing a statement that helps a scared company hide what it's done." The statement was never issued. Hargrove arrived on a Tuesday 2 days ahead of schedule. He was a tall man, lean 60 or so, with the kind of face that lawyers develop after 40 years in rooms where things were decided attentive, still giving nothing away. He came to the mill directly from the stage, without stopping at the hotel, which told Clara something about his habits. She had the documents organized and ready. He read for 2 hours. He asked 7 questions. After the 7th, he set the last document down. "You put this together in how long?" "About 6 weeks," she said. "Some of it in the first 3. He nodded. Fraudulent inducement in the original loan terms, supported by the subsidiary relationship, supported by the assessment clause violation, supported by the letters to your customers, which constitute tortious interference with existing business relationships. He looked at Clara. "Who else has copies?" "Calhoun, the Federal Land Office, your firm. And I have a second set not in this building." "Good." He folded his hands. "Meridian is going to want to settle. The federal exposure makes litigation very unattractive. I expect an offer within 2 weeks. "What will they offer?" Elias asked. "Full debt forgiveness. Possibly compensation for the pressure campaign against your customer accounts." He paused. "What they won't want is the Meridian consolidated relationship entered into the territorial court record. That's what they're most afraid of, because it exposes every other operation they've run this way." Elias and Clara looked at each other. "The public resolution," Elias said. "Whatever Calhoun and the land office need from us." Hargrove looked at both of them for a moment. "The formal hearing would be in Cheyenne, territorial court, 8 to 10 weeks out." He looked at Clara. "You'd need to testify. The case runs through what you found." "I'll testify," she said. He picked up his coffee. "Then we have a case." The weeks that followed had a different quality. The crisis pressure hadn't lifted. Meridian was still in the valley. The loan was still outstanding. The hearing was still weeks away. But something had shifted. The town felt it before it could be explained. People who had been guarded with Clara started greeting her differently. Mrs. Bellwether reported that conversations at the dry goods store had changed. Walt Henderson stopped by to confirm his second delivery and stayed for coffee, and talked about the premium flowers fall market prospects, as if assuming a future rather than hedging against the absence of one. Then Holt came back 5 days after the council meeting. He brought Margaret with him. Margaret Holt was a small, neat woman in her late 50s, with the particular confidence of someone who had mastered something she cared about deeply. She shook Clara's hand with both of hers and said without preamble, "That flower, I want to know everything about it." Clara took her through the milling process, the grade separation, the specific winter wheat intake that produced the fine milled result. Margaret asked questions that were specific and good, the questions of someone who understood her craft at the level of the material. Afterward, they stood outside while their husbands left in the office with Thomas emerged looking like men who had discovered they had more in common than either had expected. "Reginald is not a cruel man," Margaret said. "I believe that," Clara said carefully. "He's a frightened one sometimes. When he doesn't understand something, he covers it up by making the thing sound ridiculous." She paused. "You didn't look ridiculous. That frightened him." Clara thought about that. "Did he tell you that?" "He never tells me things directly," Margaret said. "But I've been married to him for 31 years. I know what it means when he works late and won't say why." She looked at Clara with the clear, level gaze of a woman who had spent 3 decades paying attention. "What you're doing here is remarkable. I want you to know someone said it plainly." Clara looked back at her. In all the weeks she had been in Willow Creek, through the laughter and the ledgers and the loan documents and the letters and the federal marshal and the town council and every battle fought and measure taken, nobody had said it plainly. They had changed their behavior. They had shifted their positions. They had moved around her like water finding a new course. But nobody had stood in front of her and said the thing directly. "Thank you," Clara said, and meant it with the whole weight of everything it covered. Margaret nodded. "Now, tell me about the fall market. Because if that flower is what I think it is, I want to be baking something that makes people ask questions." Clara told her about the fall market. They talked for another hour. By the time Elias and Reginald Holt finished their stilted conversation in the office, and emerged into the afternoon with the slightly dazed expressions of men who had unexpectedly found common ground. Their wives were deep in a conversation about market pricing and product presentation that had already outlasted them by 45 minutes. Elias looked at Clara. She looked at him. Something passed between them that didn't need words, the shared recognition of people who have been fighting hard for a long time and have just caught a glimpse of what the other side of the fight might look like. It looked like this, maybe. It looked like this. The hearing date came in a letter from Cheyenne on a gray October morning 9 weeks after Hargrove had first sat down in their office and told them they had a case. Clara read it twice. Then she set it on the desk where Elias would see it when he came in from the floor. He came in at noon flower on his sleeves and picked it up without being told what it was. He read it standing up. Then he set it back down. "November 14th, he said. 3 weeks, Clara said. "In Cheyenne." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You've testified before." "No," she said. "But I've prepared documents for people who have, and Hargrove will prepare us both before we go." She paused. "Are you afraid?" He looked at her. "Of testifying? Of any of it?" He thought about it honestly the way he thought about most things that mattered. "I'm afraid of losing," he said. "Not the hearing. The mill. I've been afraid of losing the mill for 4 years. That's a different thing from being afraid of a courtroom." "It is," she agreed. "And you? Are you afraid?" She considered it. "I'm afraid of being believed," she said. He looked at her. "What does that mean?" "I'm afraid that I'll stand up in that courtroom and say what I found and what it means, and someone will look at me the way people have been looking at me since I stepped off that stage, and decide that a woman who looks like I do can't possibly know what she's talking about." She kept her voice level. "I've been afraid of that my whole life. It's a different kind of fear from losing something you love, but it's real." Elias looked at her for a long moment. He didn't offer comfort, and he didn't diminish it. And both of those things were right. He just looked at her and said, "You're going to be believed." "How do you know that?" "Because I've watched you for 2 months, he said. "And I didn't believe you at first, Clara. Not fully. I thought maybe you knew the books, maybe you could help organize things. I didn't think you'd find what you found. I didn't think you'd do what you've done." He looked at the hearing letter on the desk. "And if I was wrong, every man in that courtroom who looks at you the way I did in the beginning is going to be wrong the same way. And you're going to show them." She looked at him. This was not the man who had pulled his hat off his head and stood in front of his own mill with resigned disappointment in his eyes on the day she arrived. That man had been present for a long time. He was gone now, replaced by something steadier and more awake. "All right," she said. 3 weeks. What happened in those 3 weeks had the relentless quality of a current that builds as it narrows. Hargrove came twice and drilled Clara on the documents, the timeline, the specific legal language she would need under examination. After the first session, he said, "Good. Now do it again and don't apologize for knowing things." She blinked. "I didn't apologize." "You softened 3 answers with 'I believe' when you meant 'I know,'" he said. In a courtroom, that's an apology. She thought about that in the evenings after. She had been softening things her whole life, not because she was uncertain, but because she had learned that certainty in a woman made people uncomfortable. She had sanded the edges off her own knowledge to make it easier for others to accept. She was done doing that. The second session, she answered everything without apology. At the end, Hargrove said simply, "That's what it needs to sound like." Meanwhile, Meridian was making noise about pulling out of the valley entirely. Finch had been seen at the hotel, looking grim, and there was a rumor that Consolidated Western had begun reviewing its entire Wyoming Territory portfolio, which made sense for a corporation being investigated at the federal level. Pete came to Clara on a Tuesday and said, "If they pull out now, what happens to the hearing? Does everything you found still matter to anyone?" She studied him. "Why are you asking?" "Because I've got a cousin in Laramie," he said. "Meridian loan, same terms, watching his operation get squeezed the same way Carter Mill was. If this quietly goes away, nothing changes for him." That landed differently than she'd expected. She told Elias that evening, "I've had 4 people ride out from other valleys in the last 2 weeks, he said. 3 mentioned Meridian by name. 1 had a loan document nearly identical to ours. He looked at his hands. "I didn't tell you. I didn't want to make it bigger than it was." "It's already bigger," she said. "Have you kept those documents?" "Every one." She wrote to Hargrove that night. He wrote back in 4 days, "Send everything." The land office needed the pattern across multiple accounts. He noted the Federal Circuit was expanding the investigation's scope and that Calhoun would return within the week. Calhoun came on a Friday and spent 3 hours with the documents Elias had gathered. When he was done, he looked up with the same expression he'd worn on his first visit. "This isn't a scheme against one mill," he said. "This is a coordinated territorial land acquisition strategy." "Yes," Clara said. "That's what it is." He put on his hat. "The November hearing is going to be larger than we initially described. Meridian will have attorneys. This will be contested." "I know," she said. "Are you prepared for that?" "I've been prepared for contested things my entire life," she said. He nodded once, the small, economical nod of a man who meant things precisely. "See you in Cheyenne, Mrs. Carter?" After he left, she wasn't afraid anymore. Not the way she'd been when she told Elias about the fear of not being believed. The documents were sound. The testimony was ready. Whatever happened in that Cheyenne courtroom, she had already proven something not to the court, not to Meridian, not even to Willow Creek, to herself. The day before they left for Cheyenne, Margaret Holt came to the mill. She walked into the kitchen where Clara was finishing a pot of coffee and sat down at the table, the way a woman sits down in a place where she has decided she's welcome. "You leave tomorrow," Margaret said. "On the early stage," Clara said. "We'll be there by evening." "And the hearing is the following morning." "Yes." Margaret looked at her. "Are you nervous?" "No," Clara said, and was surprised to realize it was true. "Good." Margaret folded her hands on the table. "I've been thinking about something I want to say before you go." Clara poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from her. "Say it." "When you first came to Willow Creek," Margaret said, "I thought you were an unfortunate woman who'd had limited options and taken the only one available. I'll be honest, I didn't say that, but I thought it." "I know," Clara said. Margaret looked at her. "You knew. I could see it. It wasn't unkind of you. It was a reasonable reading of the situation from the outside. It wasn't correct, Margaret said. No, Clara agreed. What you actually were. Margaret said, slowly working through it, the way she worked through a complicated recipe, was a woman who had been waiting for a place where her abilities would have room to function. And you came here, and you made room where there wasn't any. She paused. I've been married to Reginald for 31 years, and I have things I'm good at. I've always made them smaller than they were because that seemed to be what was required. She looked at her coffee. You didn't do that. I did it for a long time, Clara said. I got tired of it. Margaret looked up. What made you stop? My father died and my brother took over, she said. And I realized that all the years I'd spent making myself smaller hadn't protected me from anything. I lost the work anyway because I was a woman, and the work passed to the man. She paused. After that, the smallness seemed like a waste. I'd paid the cost of it and gotten nothing in return. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. What will you do after? She said. After the hearing, after all of this is over. I'll keep running the mill, Clara said. That's what I came here to do. With Elias. With Elias. Margaret smiled a small, real smile, the kind that happened when something you'd been circling resolved. He needed someone who could see that he was worth fighting for, she said. He didn't need to be seen, Clara said. He needed someone to fight beside. Margaret looked at her for a moment, and then she said something Clara would carry for a long time. Those are the same thing sometimes. They sat with the coffee until it went cold, and neither of them hurried it. The morning they left for Cheyenne, the whole of Willow Creek seemed to know. Thomas and Pete were at the gate at 5 a.m. with no particular reason given. Walt Henderson's wagon came down the north road, and Henderson himself shook Elias's hand without a word, then looked at Clara and touched the brim of his hat. Mrs. Bellwether appeared in a coat and hat that suggested she had dressed for an occasion. We'll watch the mill while you're gone, she said. Pete and Thomas have the operation, Clara said. But thank you. I'll watch them watching it, Mrs. Bellwether said firmly. Holt appeared last 5 minutes before the stage. He took his hat off when he came to stand in front of Clara. That thing I said about you the day you arrived, he said. In the store. I want you to know that I knew it wasn't right when I said it. I said it anyway because you walked in and you didn't look the way I expected, and that frightened me. And frightened men say stupid things. Clara looked at him. In all the ways this town had surprised her, in all the small recalibrations, the gradually shifting attitudes, the slow thaw of a community that had decided against her before she said a word. Reginald Holt, standing in front of her, in the pre-dawn dark, with his hat in his hand, saying the thing he'd been carrying, was not something she had expected. I know, she said. Thank you for saying it. He put his hat back on. Go win that hearing, he said. The stage came. Elias handed her up, and through the small window she could see the people gathered in the dark. Thomas, with his hands in his pockets. Pete nodding once like he was sealing an agreement. Mrs. Bellwether with her chin up, Henderson with his hat back on his head. Holt at the edge of it all, standing straight. Elias sat down across from her in the stage. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, that's more people than came to our wedding. The bar was low, she said. He almost laughed. It was, he agreed. She looked out the window as Willow Creek fell away behind them, the false dawn coming up gray and cold over the high ground to the east. Elias, she said. Yes. When we win this, and we are going to win this, what do you want for the mill? For the next 10 years? He thought about it the way he always thought about things that mattered, not quickly, not for show, but actually. I want to sell the finest flour in Wyoming Territory, he said. I want the Henderson farm and a dozen others like it bringing their grain here because there's nowhere else they'd trust. I want to enter the Territorial Agricultural Exhibition and stop apologizing for wanting to win it. He paused. I want to build something my father would recognize. Clara looked at him across the rocking stage. Then that's what we'll build, she said. He looked back at her. Not the look from the first day, not the resigned disappointment, not the careful concealment. Something else. the look of a man who had stopped bracing for loss and started making plans. The hearing room in Cheyenne was longer than either of them had expected, and smaller than the weight of it suggested. Meridian's attorneys had already arranged their materials at their table with the organized aggression of people who had been here before and intended to make that apparent. Hargrove met them at the door. He shook Elias's hand, nodded at Clara, and looked them both over. "They brought 3 attorneys," he said. "Prentice Aldwell and a man named Guthrie from back east who specializes in federal land cases. That last one's the one to watch." "What does Guthrie do?" Clara asked. "He goes after credibility," Hargrove said. "He doesn't argue the documents. He argues the witness. He'll try to make you seem either incompetent or biased, preferably both." He looked at Clara steadily. "He's very good at it." "So am I," she said. Something moved across Hargrove's face. Quick controlled the closest he'd come to impressed since he'd first read through her files. "Good," he said. "You know what you found. Don't apologize for knowing it." The judge was a man named Whitfield, who called the room to order at 9 o'clock precisely. Meridian's lead attorney, Prentice, went first polished unhurried, characterizing the loan terms as standard frontier lending practice and the acceleration clause as routine. Clara listened without expression. Then he said something that made her hands go still on the table. He said that the documents Clara had assembled were selectively gathered by a party with a personal financial interest in the outcome, and relied on an amateur reading of commercial lending law by someone with no legal training. Amateur. She had been called many things in her life. Large, plain, unfortunate, a woman from nowhere. But amateur was new. She wrote it down on the paper in front of her, folded her hands on top of it. Hargrove caught her eye. She gave him a slight nod. She was fine. She was more than fine. Guthrie came after her on cross-examination, as Hargrove had predicted. He was compact 50s, with small eyes that moved quickly, and a voice that stayed pleasant through things that were not pleasant. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "you've described your background as including management of a family grain operation in Ohio. In what capacity? Books, supply contracts, quality grading supplier agreements, and production planning," she said. "Did you hold a formal position? Were you compensated separately?" She knew exactly where this was going. "I was not paid separately," she said. "I was a member of the family operating the business." "So you were not in any formal sense employed in the grain industry?" "I ran the grain industry," she said, "for 5 years. Whether I was paid for it separately doesn't change what I did. And you have no legal training?" "No. No accounting credentials. No formal credentials. I learned what I know by doing it and reading carefully." Guthrie looked briefly at the gallery, the look that invited them to reach a conclusion he didn't need to state. "The documents you've assembled. Who helped you interpret them?" "No one," she said. "I read them, including the 1880 territorial registration document you claim establishes a relationship between Consolidated Western Holdings and Meridian Land and Commerce. That document is straightforward," she said. "It names the parent company in Section 3. Any person who reads it can see the connection." "And yet," Guthrie said pleasantly, "the attorneys for Consolidated Western Holdings who have read that same document do not see it as establishing the relationship you've described." "Then they're reading it wrong," she said. "Or they know they're reading it wrong and are hoping the court won't notice." A sound from the gallery. Judge Whitfield's expression did not change. Guthrie looked at her. He had not expected that. She could see the slight recalibration before he continued. "You're suggesting opposing counsel is deliberately misrepresenting a document." "I'm saying the document says what it says," Clara said. "And what it says is clear. Anyone in this room can read it and reach the same conclusion I did. I'd invite them to." He pivoted. "Mrs. Carter, you arrived in Willow Creek approximately 2 months ago, with no prior knowledge of Carter Mill, no familiarity with Wyoming's commercial land market. And in that time, you claim to have uncovered a multi-year coordinated fraud scheme involving a Denver corporation, its subsidiary, and a local agent." "I uncovered documents that demonstrate the connection," she said. "The scheme was already there. I just read what was in front of me." "In 2 months. The documents were in the office. They'd been there for years. Nobody had organized them and looked at them together before I did. A pause. Why did you look? The question was genuinely good. She took a moment with it. Because I was asked to manage the operation, she said. And you cannot manage something you don't understand. So I read everything. And when I read everything, the pattern was there. She paused. It wasn't invisible. It was just unread. Guthrie looked at her for a long moment. He knew when a witness had found their footing. The questions that followed were more technical, more focused on document language, less aimed at her credibility. She answered them the same way she answered everything clearly, specifically, without apology. When he sat down, Hargrove stood. Mrs. Carter, when you identify the 1880 registration document, the one Mr. Guthrie characterized as ambiguous, did you have any legal guidance in your reading of it? No, she said. I read it myself. And what did it say? That Consolidated Western Holdings Group is a subsidiary of Meridian Land and Commerce. The parent company name appears in Section 3. It's not ambiguous. Prior to your arrival at Carter Mill, how long had that document been in the mill's files? Based on the filing notation, approximately 3 years. In those 3 years, had anyone, including the attorneys for Consolidated Western Holdings, who drafted the original loan agreement, informed Mr. Carter of this subsidiary relationship? No, she said. He didn't know. When did he learn of it? When I told him, she said. Approximately 6 weeks after I arrived. Hargrove nodded. Thank you, he said, and sat down. Deputy Marshal Calhoun testified after Clara. His testimony was shorter, more focused, built around the Federal Land Office's investigation and the way Clara's documentation had provided the connective tissue the investigation had been missing. He used the word pattern 11 times. Clara counted. When he said that Carter Mill's documentation had identified a scheme affecting no fewer than 7 distinct agricultural operations across 3 Wyoming counties. The gallery was quiet, in the way galleries get quiet when something previously abstract becomes specific. At the end of the afternoon, Judge Whitfield called a recess and informed both parties he would issue his ruling in writing within 10 days. Elias looked at Clara as the room cleared. 10 days, he said. 10 days, she agreed. What do we do for 10 days? We go home, she said, and we run the mill. They collected their things. Hargrove shook both their hands. They walked out into the late October afternoon, the sky above Cheyenne, the deep blue of high country in autumn. Elias stopped on the steps. Clara, he said. She stopped beside him. Whatever the ruling says what you did in there, what you've been doing since the day you arrived, that doesn't depend on what a judge writes. You know that. She looked at him. I know. I want to make sure you know, he said. Because I didn't say it enough. You saved the mill. Whatever happens in the next 10 days, you saved it. And I'm not going to not say that. Clara looked at him in the autumn light. 2 months ago, she had walked up the path to a broken mill and a man who looked at her with polite resignation. She had read ledgers until the light failed, fought a Denver corporation and a town's worth of small cruelties, and a lending scheme designed to be invisible. She had done all of it the same careful, patient, relentless way, paying attention to things other people found beneath them, trusting what she found. And here was this man standing on courthouse steps, saying what he meant. Thank you, Elias, she said. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked down the steps, and the road back to Willow Creek was waiting, and 10 days would pass one way or another, and whatever the judge decided, the water wheel would keep turning. It had always kept turning. The wheel was damaged, not dead. The operation struggling, not finished. The man who owned it tired, not broken. You just needed to listen well enough to hear the difference. The ruling came on a Thursday, not 10 days later. 8. 8 days after they'd walked down those Cheyenne courthouse steps and climbed back into the stage and ridden home to Willow Creek, in the kind of quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, just full. The kind of quiet that settles between two people who have been through something together and don't need to talk about it yet. Clara was in the office when Hargrove's letter arrived. Thomas brought it in at mid-morning and set it on the desk without a word, but his face said what he knew about it, which was only that it was from Cheyenne, and it had arrived fast, and fast was either very good or very bad. She looked at the envelope for a moment. Then she opened it. Hargrove had written 2 paragraphs before the ruling itself, and she read those 2 paragraphs standing up the same way she'd read the hearing date letter 8 weeks earlier. The first paragraph described the judge's findings of fact. The second described the remedy ordered. Then the ruling itself in the plain language of the territorial court. The loan agreement between Consolidated Western Holdings Group and Carter Mill was found to have been entered into through fraudulent inducement. The acceleration clause was voided. The outstanding principal was restructured at legal rates for a 10-year repayment term. Meridian Land and Commerce was ordered to cease all coordinated acquisition activities in the 3 affected Wyoming counties, pending a federal review of its full lending portfolio. Garrett Finch, as a named agent of Meridian, was barred from commercial real estate transactions in Wyoming Territory for a period of 5 years. And one line at the bottom of the ruling, which Judge Whitfield appeared to have included with the particular care of a man who wanted something on the record. The court notes that the pattern of fraud documented in this case was identified, organized, and presented primarily through the work of Mrs. Clara Carter of Willow Creek, Wyoming Territory, whose diligence and precision in examining documentary evidence proved essential to the administration of justice in this matter. Clara set the letter down. She sat down. She sat there for a moment in the quiet office with the sound of the water wheel coming through the walls, and the sound of Thomas moving around in the storage room, and the sound of the creek running the way it had always run, and she let herself feel the full weight of it for exactly as long as it took to feel it completely. Then she stood up, picked up the letter, and went to find Elias. He was at the wheel, same as most mornings, running a production check on the fine-grade output. He saw her coming, and he read her face the way he'd learned to read it over 3 months. Not slowly, not with effort, just immediately, the way you read something you know well. He didn't say anything. She handed him the letter. He read it. Then he read the last line again. Then he looked at her. "The court notes," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked down at the letter again. He was quiet for a long time, and she let him be quiet because some things needed space to land before they could be spoken. When he finally looked up, there was something in his face she had not seen before. Not relief, not triumph, not the particular satisfaction of having won something. Something quieter and more permanent than any of those things. "My father never got a ruling like this," he said. "He never needed one. But if he had," he stopped. "He would have been proud of you." Clara looked at him. She had been told she was good at things before. She had been praised for her work by people who respected the work without seeing the person who did it. Elias Carter was not praising her work. He was telling her that his father, the man who had built this mill in 1861 and run it for 23 years and poured his whole life into this valley, would have been proud of her specifically, not of what she'd done, of her. She found she didn't have anything to say to that which was unusual for her. "Thank you," she said. He folded the letter and handed it back. "What happens to Finch?" 5-year commercial bar, she said. "He can't operate in the territory." And Meridian, federal portfolio review, every operation structured the same way, every loan with the same acceleration terms, every subsidiary pressure scheme gets examined. Pete's cousin in Laramie, the 4 Valley operations we documented. All of them. Elias was quiet for a moment. "We didn't just win our case." "No," she said. "We changed the cost calculation for anyone trying the same thing in this territory. That's what Hargrove wanted. That's what Calhoun wanted. It's why we pushed for the public resolution instead of a quiet settlement." He looked at her. "Is that what you wanted?" She thought about it honestly. "I wanted Carter Mill to survive," she said. That was the first thing. But once I understood the scope of it, once Pete told me about his cousin, once the other Valley men started coming out stopping it just for us, wasn't enough. It wasn't the right answer if it left everyone else in the same trap we'd been in. He was quiet for another moment. My father used to say the mill was a responsibility, not just a business. I know, she said. You told me. I think I understand what he meant now, Elias said. Better than I did before you came. She looked at him. What does it mean? He thought about it. It means that what you build matters beyond you. The farmers who bring their grain here, the families who buy the flour, the workers who depend on the operation, they're part of what the mill is. Not just customers, part of it. He paused. My father understood that, and I lost it somewhere in the years of just trying to hold on. You gave it back to me. Clara looked at this man she had married 3 months ago in an 11-minute ceremony with flour-dusted witnesses and no ceremony whatsoever. This man she had sat across from, at a desk covered in ledgers and loan documents and the wreckage of a business being dismantled by people who thought nobody was paying attention. She had been paying attention. She was always paying attention. Come on, she said. We need to tell Thomas and Pete. The reaction in the mill was not dramatic. Pete nodded twice with the slow deliberateness of a man receiving information he had expected but needed to hear confirmed. Thomas's mouth opened and then closed and then opened again, and he said, well, and didn't finish the sentence and didn't need to. Clara told them about the ruling about Finch's Bar, about the Meridian Review, about Pete's cousin in Laramie being among the operations that would now be examined. Pete looked at her when she said his cousin's name. He's going to be all right, he said. I can't promise that, she said. But the situation that was designed to make him fail is being dismantled. What he does with that is up to him. Pete nodded. Then he said, Thank you, Mrs. Carter, and went back to work because that was what Pete did with things that mattered. He worked them rather than spoke them. Thomas came to Clara at the end of the day. Can I ask you something? Of course, she said. When you first came here, when you started reading the books, did you know what you'd find? She thought about it honestly. I knew there were problems. I didn't know what kind. The Meridian piece, I found that by accident or close enough. I was reading a filing document that should have been routine, and I found a name I'd seen somewhere else, and I followed it. Thomas looked at her. What if you hadn't found it? Then we'd have fixed what we could and fought with what we had, she said. The wheel was broken. The grades were mixed. The contracts were unfair. Those were real problems with real solutions, and we'd have worked through them. The Meridian piece made it bigger, but it didn't make the rest of it less real. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't think you'd last, he said. When you first came, I thought Mr. Carter had made a mistake, and it would be obvious within a week and you'd be on the next stage back east. I know, she said. I was wrong, he said. You were working with the information you had, she said. That's all any of us do. He nodded. Went back to work. The news moved through Willow Creek the way everything moved through Willow Creek, fast, imperfectly arriving at some doors before others and carrying different amounts of detail depending on who was carrying it. By Thursday evening, Mrs. Bellwether came by not on a pretext, just directly herself with Harold, and sat at the kitchen table and said, The whole ruling. Tell me the whole ruling. Clara told her. Then she read her the last line, the court's note. Mrs. Bellwether was quiet for a moment. They put it in writing. Yes, Clara said. A territorial court put it in writing that a woman from Willow Creek, a woman who arrived here 3 months ago with a travel bag, was essential to the administration of justice. That's what it says. Harold Bellwether, who had said very little since arriving, said, I want a copy of that. I'll have Thomas make you one, Clara said. I want to frame it, Harold said. For the dry goods store. Clara looked at him. That's not necessary. It's not necessary, Harold agreed. But I want to do it. So people remember what happened here. So they know what it looks like when someone pays attention when everyone else has stopped. The following morning, Reginald Holt walked into the mill office. Not Margaret. Not a note sent through a third party. Holt himself in his hat, with the particular bearing of a man who has decided to do something and is doing it before he talks himself out of it. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the county exhibition." Clara looked up from the premium-grade pricing schedule she'd been working on. "All right. The Wyoming Territorial Agricultural Exhibition, in the spring. Carter Mill hasn't entered in 3 years." "No," she said. "I think you should enter," he said, "the flower category. And I think if you're willing that Margaret and I would like to sponsor the entry, formally. Our name alongside yours." Clara looked at him. Reginald Holt, who had said on her first day that Elias Carter had sent for a wife and gotten a woman who looked like she'd eaten 2 wives already. Reginald Holt, who had been telling Willow Creek for 3 months that she was making a fool of the man she'd married. Reginald Holt, who had come to her mill with his hat in his hand, twice now, both times, saying the thing he hadn't been able to say before. "Why?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Because I know what the flower is worth," he said. "And because my wife won a competition she hadn't won in 4 years using it. And because the right thing to do and the useful thing to do happened to be the same thing this time, and I'm not going to pass up a chance like that." Clara almost smiled. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me." "Probably," he agreed. "I'll talk to Elias," she said. She talked to Elias that evening. He listened to the whole thing. Then, "Holt wants to put his name on our exhibition entry." "Yes." "The man who—" "Yes," she said. "That man." Elias looked at the ceiling. "Why do you want to say yes?" "Because it matters what story people tell about this place," she said. "Right now the story is that Carter Mill fought Meridian and won. That's a good story. But the better story, the one that lasts, is that a mill that was nearly destroyed by outside interests came back and became something this whole valley is proud of. And for that story to be true, we need Reginald Holt's name on things." She paused. "Not for him. For the valley." Elias thought about it. "And for the exhibition specifically, our flower is good enough to win," she said simply. "And if we win with Holt's sponsorship, it changes what he's known for. Right now he's known for being the man who laughed at me. A year from now, I'd rather he was known as the man who backed the operation that won the exhibition." He looked at her. "You're protecting him." "I'm protecting the story," she said. "There's a difference." He was quiet for another long moment. Then, "Tell Holt yes." The winter came early to Willow Creek that year, and Carter Mill ran through it with a steadiness that was different in quality from anything the operation had been in the 4 years before Clara arrived. Not just more stable, more intentional. She had built systems that held the grade separation, the supplier agreements, the customer communication protocols, the production schedules that aligned with the valley's growing seasons. The mill didn't just run. It ran like something that understood what it was doing and why. 3 things happened in January that mattered. The first was Hargrove's letter, confirming that 6 of the 7 agricultural operations identified in the Meridian case had successfully petitioned for loan restructuring under the precedent established by the Carter Mill ruling. Pete's cousin in Laramie was among them. Clara read that letter twice and folded it carefully and put it in the file she had started keeping for documents that weren't about the mill's finances, but about what the mill's fight had meant beyond itself. The second was a letter from a woman in Casper, Wyoming, whom Clara had never met, who had read about the case in the territorial newspaper and was writing to ask for advice. She said she was managing the books for her husband's lumber operation and had noticed anomalies in their lending agreement that she couldn't explain. She listed the anomalies. Clara read them and recognized 3 of the 4. She wrote back immediately. She told the woman what to look for and where to look, told her about Hargrove, in Cheyenne, told her about Calhoun's circuit office, and what documents they would need to see. She ended the letter. "You are not imagining it. You know what you found. Trust what you know." Elias read the draft before she sent it. "You're going to get more letters like this," he said. "Probably," she said. "Are you going to answer them all?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Of course." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded the way he nodded when something aligned with what he already understood to be true. "My father would have written back too," he said. The third thing that happened in January was the first time Elias reached across the desk and put his hand over hers. Not dramatically, not as a declaration. They were reviewing the spring production schedule, cross-checking it against the exhibition entry requirements, and the Henderson Farms expanded commitment. And she said something about the premium grade output projections, and he looked at the numbers and saw that she was right, and he reached across and put his hand over hers for a moment, the way you touch something real to make sure it's there. She looked down at his hand. Then she looked at him. He was looking at the numbers. Or pretending to look at the numbers. His jaw had gone slightly tight in the way it went when he was feeling something he hadn't yet found the right words for. "Elias," she said. He looked at her. "The numbers are good," she said. "I know," he said. He didn't move his hand. She didn't move hers. They stayed like that for a moment, and then she said, "We should finish the schedule." And he said, "Yes." And they both went back to the schedule. But something had changed in the quality of the room, the way things change when two people who have been careful with each other for a long time stop being quite so careful. It was not a declaration. It was something more honest than a declaration. It was a beginning. Spring came to Willow Creek with the particular abruptness of high country weather, going from gray and cold to clear and bright in the space of what felt like a single morning. Clara stood outside the mill on the first genuinely warm day of March, a cup of coffee in her hand, listening to the wheelwork through the increased snowmelt flow with the clean, even sound of machinery that had been repaired and maintained and cared for properly. Thomas came out and stood beside her. "Exhibitions in 6 weeks," he said. "I know," she said. "Are we ready?" She thought about the 3 grades, the production levels, the quality consistency they'd been tracking through the winter. She thought about the Holt sponsorship and what it represented. She thought about Margaret Holt baking bread with their flour and winning a competition she'd given up on and about Walt Henderson's wagons, pulling up on a Tuesday with 200 bushels that were now part of something that worked. "Yes," she said. "We're ready." Thomas nodded. Then, "Mrs. Carter." She looked at him. "When you first came here, I know I said I thought you wouldn't last. But I want you to know something. The reason I thought that wasn't because you seemed like you couldn't do the work. I thought you wouldn't last because I'd seen how hard this valley is on people who don't fit what it expects." He looked at the mill. "I was wrong about which one of you would change." She looked at him. "Which one?" "I thought the valley would change you," he said. "Make you smaller. Make you leave." He paused. "Instead, you changed the valley." Clara held her coffee and looked at the creek and the wheel and the old timber of the mill that Elias Carter's father had built in 1861, and that had kept turning for 24 years through good seasons and bad, through a man's life, and then his son's life, and now through hers. "I didn't change the valley," she said. "I paid attention to it. There's a difference." Thomas thought about that. "Maybe," he said. "But some things only change when someone pays attention to them the right way." He went back inside. She stood there a little longer with the coffee and the creak and the sound of the wheel, and she thought about the woman who had stood in a general store 4 months ago with mud on her boots and looked a room full of laughing men in the eye without flinching. She had known even then, even in the worst of it, that the laughter was not the truth of what she was worth. That the judgment of people who didn't know her was not the measure of what she was capable of. That the only way to prove what you were made of was to do the work and let the results speak. She had done the work. The Wyoming Territorial Agricultural Exhibition took place on the 14th of April in a hall in Cheyenne that Clara had last seen as a courtroom. Walking into it felt like closing a circle. She did not go alone. Elias was beside her, and Thomas and Pete had come along because they'd asked, and she'd said yes, and Walt Henderson had driven down with his family because his wife had decided she wanted to see the flower that Walt had been talking about for 3 months entered into a competition. Mrs. Bellwether had come with Harold and a new hat that she wore with the dignity of a woman who understood the occasion. Reginald Holt and Margaret came on their own stage, arriving that morning with the Holt Mercantile banner made up for the occasion. Carter Mill Willow Creek, sponsored by Holt Mercantile. Margaret had personally lettered it. It was, Clara thought, the finest thing Holt had ever put his name on. The judges were three men who had been evaluating territorial agricultural products for a combined 40 years. They worked through the flour category methodically, without commentary, with the attention of people who understood what they were measuring. Carter Mill's premium winter wheat flour was the last entry they evaluated. The eldest judge, a lean man named Harrington, who had been doing this since the territory was young, picked up a handful of the flour, pressed it between his fingers, looked at it in the light, and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Where did this come from?" "Willow Creek," Clara said. "Carter Mill." He looked at her, then at the flour, then at the other two judges, who had now picked up samples of their own. The second judge said, "This is exceptional." The third judge nodded once and put his sample down with the care of someone setting down something valuable. Harrington looked at Clara again. "How long has this mill been producing at this grade?" "About 4 months," she said. "We were producing it before that, but not separated from the other grades. We reorganized the production process last autumn." He looked at the flour one more time. "This is the finest flour I've seen from a frontier operation in 20 years of judging this category." Clara said nothing. She let it land the way things need to land. She let it be true. Carter Mill won first place. The announcement came with no drama, just a card placed on the table in front of their entry, and a handshake from Harrington that was firm and meant something. Elias's hand found hers the moment the card went down, not reaching for it, just there, the way things are when they're where they're supposed to be. Thomas made a sound that was not quite a shout, but was in that direction. Pete said, with the resonance of profound satisfaction. Walt Henderson clapped once, twice, and then stopped because that seemed like enough. Mrs. Bellwether tilted her chin up in the way she had and looked around the room as though daring anyone to be surprised. Margaret Holt leaned over to Reginald and said something in his ear. He looked at Clara. He tipped his hat. She nodded at him. One clean nod. That was enough. The drive back to Willow Creek that afternoon had a quality Clara had not felt since before her father died, since before she'd spent 5 years running an operation that passed to someone else, since before she'd learned that the world did not reliably reward the people who did the work. She had known that fact for a long time. She knew it still. The world was not reliably fair, and it would not always see what you were worth without being shown. But it could be shown. That was what she had learned. Not that things were fair, but that the truth could be made visible if someone was willing to do the work of making it visible. That evidence was real. That documentation held. That a woman with a travel bag and mud on her boots, and the knowledge she had spent her whole life building, could walk into a broken operation, pay attention to what was actually there, and change what happened next. She had done that. She was still doing that. And she would keep doing it as long as the creek ran, and the wheel turned, and the work was there to be done. Elias was looking at her from the seat across the stage. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She looked at him. This man she had married out of necessity, who had become over 4 months of shared work and shared fights, and shared early mornings and late nights, and the relentless accumulation of having been through something hard together, someone she had not expected and could not now imagine not having. "I'm thinking about next year's exhibition," she said. He almost laughed. "You just won this year's." "I know," she said. "Next year, I want to win by more." He shook his head. He was smiling now, fully, properly, the smile that had been rare at the beginning and was becoming less rare with every week, the smile of a man who had stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop and started believing in the ground under his feet. "All right," he said. "Then that's what we'll do." Outside, the spring territory rolled past them, and Willow Creek was waiting, and Carter Mill was waiting, and the water wheel was turning, and the work was there to be done. It had always been there to be done. The only question had ever been, who would show up to do it? Clara Whitmore had shown up. And the mill, the valley, the whole long story of what one woman's refusal to be underestimated could accomplish